Welcome, audience, on this 21st of October 2024 to the 12th episode of Werewolf. Today we will be speaking to an interesting new contributor to Arctos International. So his website, also you can of course look at it. There will be a link added to this podcast. Ahnaf Ibn Qais. He is somebody that has created quite a stir around himself by his quite remarkable articles, his contributions to Arctos, as well as his quite lively podcast that he has produced. He is somebody that I consider a real gain for Arctos, somebody that has literally broken open the boundaries in which we are operating. So let's say he has opened the Overton window also within the Dissident Right, bring to attention discourses and narratives that have been neglected over these last years. Ahnaf, welcome, a warm welcome to this podcast.
Good day to Sir Alexander. It is afternoon where both of us are at. But no, thank you for the warm introduction. Yeah, and happy to be here.
Well, let's first start with your name. It's an interesting and very beautiful name. When I looked at it, I had a fake association with the general that conquered the Persian Empire, Ahnaf Ibn Qais. Tell me something about this name. Why did you choose it? And what is your reason for using it as a pseudonym for your publications?
Sure. So Abu Bakr al-Ahnaf Ibn Qais, right? Muslim commander, lived during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And he was from the Banu Tamim tribe. Now, the interesting thing about that particular tribe was that they were pretty far away, right? And Al-Ahnaf, he was actually born with a defect, right? He was club-footed. That's actually what his name means. Al-Ahnaf means the club-footed, right? Now, what was fascinating about him was that throughout his life, because he was far away, right? And I believe they were a lot closer to Yemen, like towards the north of Yemen or whatnot, if my history is decent. But throughout his life, he never met the Prophet ﷺ and whatnot. He learned about Islam indirectly, right? When the Blessed Prophet ﷺ sent a missionary, right? And without ever having to meet him and without ever having to interact with him at a personal level, right? Al-Ahnaf, he accepted Islam. And because he was the leader of the tribe, the rest of them did as well, right? So, like nowadays people have this notion that, oh, Islam is violent. They want to conquer Europe and do all this stuff to us or whatever, right? That's really not the case. I mean, throughout Islamic history, yes, you could argue that there have been conquests and whatnot. Europeans have fought Muslims and vice versa. You've got the Crusades, you've got all these other things. But what I always like to point out to people is that the majority of conversions have happened via mimesis, via peaceful exchange, via trade and commerce, and so on and so forth, right? So, yes, Al-Ahnaf, he was a fantastic general. You're referring to the Battle of the Oxus River, where he routed the Persian army, right? And that was actually the pivotal battle after which the Persian Empire, which at the time was like a Zoroastrian superstate, it was conquered, right? But before that, right, before all of those military exploits, before all of that, he was a man of peace. He was a man of diplomacy. He was a man of high etiquette and standards and so on and so forth, right? And so when I use that pseudonym, that's kind of what I want to kind of emulate, right? Obviously, I'm not going to live up to that expectation, but I'm going to try to the best of my ability. So in that way, right, Al-Ahnaf is someone who really, really appeals to me.
Well, of course, there's a little trick in the name as well, because Qais is not only meaning tough and strong, but also model. And of course, a role model in a certain way. What you're saying is very correct. Of course, he was a Hanif. He was somebody that was already belonging to Islam before even the message came to him. You can say in a certain sense, somebody that's upright and available for receiving the message. Of course, I also concur with your statement about how Islam spread originally, mimesis, you could say. I think it came as a liberation for many people in the Middle East, in the Byzantine Empire, as well as the Zoroastrian Empire, and that's the reason why it was so successful. Of course, it was a liberation movement in many ways. and it actually
Yeah.
naturally superseded what came before, the monotheistic religions before.
Mm,
But
mm, mm, mm.
going to your own personal background, we can talk about perhaps something that you yourself pointed to, an influence that was important. Recep Centric. So I heard of him
Mhm,
marginally. Tell us something
mhm,
about him. This is important for the audience because it will be covering new terrain. Non-Western sociology, of course, that's what he is most
mhm.
specialized for. Can you tell us something about how he has influenced your work and worldview?
Sure. I mean, Professor Centurk, I'm not a expert on his thought, but he is a Turkish academic, sociologist of religion. And I think like the name of the university was Ibn Khaldun University. So he was president of that place. Uh, with regard to what he's really well known for, he is basically a modern day student of the famed Muslim sociologist Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun is, for those of our dear listeners and readers who don't know who that is, he's the one who coined the term asabiya, right? Asabiya is a Arabic word. It doesn't really have an exact English translation. Uh, you can kind of use Aristotle's concept of philia, which is the bonds rather, and the friendship and the kin ties of kinhood that exist between people of you know a common ethnicity, race, or what have you, right? You can kind of say, okay, asabiya is similar to that, but that's not quite what it is. It's more, if I had to describe it using multiple English words, it would be like the glue that holds society together, right? So, in terms of what Professor Recep Senturk's good at, he's good at taking Ibn Khaldun, taking asabiya, and really applying it to uh, the modern world with regard to okay, the contemporary landscape of not just East and West relations, but also with regard to, okay, we kind of see what the West's up to. We kind of see what the Islamic world is up to. Uh, how are they doing, right? Is it the case that Asabiya is being retained? Is it the case that it's degrading? Is it the case that it's increasing and so on and so forth, right? So, once again, I'm not a scholar on Professor Centurk, but when I read his work, that's my layman interpretation of what he's trying to do.
Yes, well,
Hello, can you hear me?
this brings, of course, to your specialty,
Hmm, hmm, hmm.
which is, of course, geopolitics. Geopolitics
Yes, yes,
now and here, but of course informed by what you said,
yes, yes, yes.
ancient insights, Asabiye as
Hmm,
an
hmm, hmm,
important element we mentioned.
hmm.
And it is from that point of view, that geopolitical insight, that also you are
Hmm,
looking at the predicament of the West. I found this very interesting. So
hmm, hmm.
we are talking here largely for a dissident right. So that means
Mm, 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 mm.
European audience. And what I find
Yes, yes,
important is
yes.
that you bring an outside perspective to bear on the predicament, I call it, of the West. Actually, I go further than that. I say it's the fall of the West, but we can talk about that later. In any case,
Sure, sure, sure.
you are, of course, the doom merchant. So doom and gloom that's your specialty, geopolitically
Yes,
as well
sir.
as metapolitically, and you're appreciated for
Hmm,
that. But
hmm.
tell us something about how you, looking from an Islamic perspective, a non-Western perspective, experience the West because you have direct experience with it, and
Yes, yes, yes.
you have followed its thinkers, you have followed its politics. What's your general view of it, and how does that tie into your doom and gloom view?
My doom and gloom view. That's a nice way of putting it. So yeah, I do say on my Substack, I've got two Substack. The first one you alluded to it, the fall of the West. So I kind of look at the present moment of the West, and I kind of like extend into the future a few years and decades and whatnot. Uh, and basically, I'm studying the decline and fall of the West as it happens right in front of us. My second Substack is the Annals of America, where I kind of look at America, who's the current hegemon of the world, and I kind of look at its past and I move up to the present moment. So both the substacks actually work in an organic fashion. One of them moves from past to present, the other one moves from present to future. With regard to my experience of the West, yeah, once upon a time I lived in the West. I lived in Canada. I lived for a short time in Europe. But basically, just to go back to Ibn Khaldun for a second, right? Ibn Khaldun and he's not the only one, to be fair. Other people in the Islamic world also came up with that concept, but he came up with the cyclical theory of empire, right? Now, you could argue that, okay, well, other people, maybe in India and China, figured this out earlier, perhaps, right? But in terms of my part of the world and the civilization I come from, he came up with it in the best part way, right? And the cyclical theory of empire, really, if you want to get a Westerner's take on it, you should read Spengler, right? Spengler had this notion that civilization, society, these types of things, they are organic in the way that people are organic, right? They have a life cycle, they are born, they grow old, they become teenagers, then adolescents, then adults, right? There's a productive period and whatnot. Then there is a stagnant period. And after that, you have old age and then death, right? In terms of what I see the West as presently, I am seeing it as something that is in its old age and that is rapidly dying, right? Obviously Spengler has a lot to say about that with regard to second religiosity and all the other indicators. But really, to kind of maybe put my cards on the table, I see the First and Second World Wars as a tragedy for Europe. And basically, what happened in those world wars was that Faustian man, right? Infinite linear expansion and what have you across space and time. That notion suffered a huge setback, right? Now, of course, uh, even when you do suffer setback and you do suffer stagnation, you do get some productive activity, right? And in terms of what I can pin it down to myself, right? Like John Michael Greer, he had an essay. John Michael Greer is a doomer as well. He is a what's the word I'm looking for? He is also a student of Spengler. He is also a student of that stuff, but he also looks at it from a more like deep ecology lens, right? But his notion was that America really kind of reached its peak with the Apollo moon landings, right? 1969, then, you had a few more victory laps, but that was really it. After that, most of the other stuff with like technology and, oh, hey, my iPhone 16 or whatever it is people are up to these days, iPhone 16 or iPhone 19, I don't know what the latest one is, but all of this is mostly just gimmicks, right? Yeah, people are having bigger screen televisions. People are having all these other things, right? But the asabiya is gone. Uh, Most people do not live meaningful lives anymore. They're kind of like engaged in hedonism, debauchery, excess, and whatnot. I mean, they don't call it that, right? But they kind of try to justify it that way. Uh, a lot of people, they kind of are of the view that, oh, the parrot is not dead. It's just like napping. Don't worry, it's gonna rise up any second now. But the creative power is basically gone. Uh, I don't know if you know, but there's like a Swedish company, for example. I forget the exact name, but when we had Malcolm Chayune on our podcast, I think this was like episode 45 of the podcast that Sir Kenaz and myself do. But like Malcolm Chayone, he made the point that the Swedes, they wanted to build batteries by themselves and they couldn't do it. And so what they did was they called the Chinese over and like, hey, can you help us out with battery technology? And the Chinese are like, sure, we'll help you out. We'll give you our 30-year-old battery technology because we don't want to share trade secrets with you, right? And the Swedish got very angry at it. They're like, oh, the evil Chinese, they're hoarding these things. They're not giving us their, you know, latest new battery technology. How dare they? This is what the evil communists do to us or whatever, right? Anyways, the long story short, like that particular story that Malcolm was saying, that really in a microcosm encapsulates the West right now. The West right now is basically complaining about other people cheating and doing bad stuff to them and what have you and whatnot. But in terms of the true creative essence of Faustian man, that is gone right now. Um, he's kind of like saying that, okay, we're having this temporary slump. We'll get back up any second now. But in the meantime, he's blaming everyone else. He's like, well, the reason we're not excelling is because you guys are holding us down and you guys are so evil and what have you, right? So they're kind of like lashing out and reacting to everyone, whether it's calling the Chinese evil, whether it's calling Russian civilization evil, right? Whether it's calling the Muslims the savages and the barbarians. That's basically what's going on right now. Could it have been different? Could things have unfolded differently? Sure, right? But I think the time for that passed long ago. I think one of the things that Western civilization did was that after World War II, rather than pursue a more ecologically balanced worldview and whatnot, they went all in, right? They put all their eggs in the basket of like infinite linear expansion, infinite growth, and whatnot. And I mean, we can get into it if you want, but I actually think the migration issue is a result of that mindset, right? But that's kind of like in a nutshell. And again, apologies for like rambling for so long, but that in a nutshell is how I view the West right now with regard to how it's behaving, what it views other people as, how it kind of views the world around it, and so on and so forth.
Well, you talk in your essays about the moribund West, so the West
Yes,
that's
yes,
going
yes.
that's at its last legs.
Hmm.
You talk about immigration, and you mentioned this in this connection now as well. I'd
Hmm.
like to
Hmm.
remind our
Hmm.
audience of our Dissident Right fellow publicist E. Michael Jones, who comes, of course, from a
Hmm.
traditionalist
Hmm.
Catholic point of view, and he had a very interesting thing to say. He said people should realize that the net number of non-Western immigrants into the West is approximately, since about 1965, is approximately the same as the number of abortions committed in the West. It's a very interesting
Yes,
parallel.
yes.
Yes,
Very important. Very
which
important.
which which ties into this issue. Well, for people that are interested in the precise analysis that you give, they can look on the website The Fall of the West. Links will be given below. I will shortly
Nice, nice.
summarize a few of your words, if you permit me.
Sure, sure, sure.
The 11th of January 2024, you wrote, I think this is an important um, essay as well, about the domestic dynamics. So the
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
internal situation in the West, the terminal rot, captured leadership, um, the process by which education is disappearing under the
Hmm.
motto
Hmm.
"garbage in and garbage out." I found it a very good article. Then you follow up on the 30th of January with this year, of course, Great Satan and Last Man, which is more
Oh
of
yeah, oh yeah.
a geopolitical assessment of the same. So this is the
Hmm.
Western
Hmm. Hmm.
predicament in geopolitical sense, talking
Hmm.
about
Hmm. Hmm.
the civil war-like phenomenon that we are seeing, satanic
Hmm. Hmm.
worship,
Hmm.
um, the role of Europe as a satrapy of America,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
of
yeah.
course the large geopolitical picture of Zugzwang, as a beautiful German word, means that you have to do something that you don't want to. And then
Absolutely, absolutely.
in June 24, you wrote probably your most controversial article, Eurabia Ascendant. This directly opposes, of course, falling west with rising Islam. And of course, this is
Hmm.
quite
Hmm.
not to swallow for many Westerners who still live in all kinds of illusions and who still think that things can be resurrected, zombie-like.
Yeah, yeah,
That are
yeah,
in
yeah.
fact not forever. Now,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
zoom
Hmm.
in on that last article. So you're talking about large, let's say, macro social trends. So a lot of moral
Yes.
ability as a cultural phenomenon. But
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
also
Hmm.
talk about something that is very directly relevant for the movement we are talking to today, the
Hmm.
dissident
Hmm.
right.
Hmm.
You're talking about the splintering of the dissident right, for example, in
Yes,
migrants
yes,
and
yes, yes.
Christians. And this is a very important point. So the dissident right wants to be a metapolitical powerhouse, has been, in fact, in a certain sense. Give
Yes,
us your
yes.
assessment of the dissident right as it exists now, after the start of the Great
Sure.
Reset, so 2020, please.
Absolutely, absolutely. So in order to do that, we need to understand the foundations, right? Western civilization has three pillars. The first one is Christianity. The second one is the Greco-Roman philosophical rather and legal tradition. And the third one is the European spirit. Now, what does European spirit mean? Basically, it means all of the various pagan peoples, whether they're Germanic, Slavic, or what have you, and their different ways of living the good life with regard to, you know, tribal life, statecraft, and so on and so forth, right? Now, what's happening in the dissident right at the moment is people are rejecting one or more of the pillars of the West, right? The vitalists reject the Christianity pillar, right? And when I say reject, I don't mean that they dislike Christians per se. What I'm saying is they look at the Christianity pillar and they say, well, look, we've tried this confluence of these three things. We've gotten to this mess. What is the weak link here? And then their assessment is, well, it's Christianity, right? Christianity is the slave morality religion. It is leading to all this other stuff. and Christianity is like the grandmother of communism, basically. It's the mother of liberalism and it's the grandmother of communism. It has led to all these things. We gotta excise Christianity, right? They're not against Christians, right? But they're like, their attitude is, okay, well, it's not a European religion. It is a Middle Eastern religion. It's not compatible with European civilization, right? That's the vitalists, right? Then you've got the Christian nationalists and that crowd of people. Sometimes they call themselves like Christians with a capital C. Sometimes they call themselves something else. But their attitude is, well, look, what is wrong here? Which of the three pillars is wrong? Well, Christianity gave Europe a unified sense of self. Christianity is the reason why the Muslims were repelled at the Battle of Tours. Christianity is the reason why the Battle of Lepanto was won in 1571. Christianity is the reason why the Ottomans were, defeated at the Siege of Vienna, 1683. So Christianity is not the problem. Christianity is the solution. Christianity is the shield of Europe. So we have to keep Christianity. And in terms of the Greco-Roman legal heritage and the philosophical heritage, that's great so long as it's compatible with Christianity. So by process of elimination, what's wrong with our current predicament? Oh, it's this other thing. It's this like European spirit stuff, which has these like pagan elements in it, which is kind of like rotting the edifice, right? And then people kind of from that sphere of the dissident right, they make their arguments with regard to, okay, you guys, you want this Nietzschean vitalist society, but such a society ipso facto would view the old and children and these people as inefficient and as burdensome. So what you guys are going to do is you're just going to give us a Brave New World style dystopia. So you guys are wrong, and here's why we are right. Okay, those are the two groups. There's a third group. It's a much smaller group. It's the group which goes that, okay, what's wrong is not Christianity. What's wrong is not European spirit and this kind of stuff. What's wrong is the Greco-Roman philosophical and legal heritage, right? Now, I've not really seen what these people call themselves. I've only met a few of them online and what have you. They make some interesting arguments. One of the arguments they make is that the reason we're in this mess is because Christianity being from the Middle East and whatnot in its origin views time and space in a very specific way, in a very Magian way, right? But in terms of what the Greco-Roman tradition does, it views time in a more presentist fashion, right? So the Apollonian civilization, right, as Spengler likes to call it, one of the things about it is that it has a very presentist view of the world, you know, the strength of the body, the virility of the body, and so on and so forth, right? So this presentism is not really compatible with this other stuff, the eternalism and whatnot, the cavern-like way in which existence is in the Magian worldview. So in that way, there's a problem. And there's also a problem in the Greco-Roman legal and philosophical tradition with regard to the European spirit component. So what we need to do is we need to get rid of that one. Now, this third group is a fringe, even in the dissident right. Like I said, I don't know what they call themselves nowadays. They're probably going to come up with a label for themselves after this podcast is recorded or whatnot. But that's kind of what's going on in a nutshell. Again, sorry for rambling. But these three groups are fighting one another. And presently, I do not see them stopping anytime soon because their visions of what the West ought to be, what the dissident right ought to be, and so on and so forth are so at odds with one another that they're going to keep on fighting until, again, one of them gains power and influence and edges the other two out, or you get to some other like concord where they decide to set aside their differences and negotiate something out, right? But until that happens, they're going to be in this like fight against one another.
Well, you bring up some interesting points here, the division being one of them inside the dissident right. Of course, it is true that the moment you have to discuss who you are, you have to discuss your identity, you are lost.
Yes.
It means you haven't any. And one of the characteristics of a real identity is that it's dynamic, that it is alive,
yes,
and grow, and it can develop. And in that sense, of course, there is a lot to learn from processes that already have taken place in Europe that people are not looking at. For example, people forget that a large part of the continent of Europe and of white people, Caucasian people living in Europe are already for a very long time Muslim. So, for example, Albanians, people living in Albania, even an Aryan nation by linguistic standards, is as long Muslim as Lithuanians are Christian. People forget about that. The same is
mhm,
true for others, so Bosnians
mhm,
or the North Caucasian peoples. They are Muslim, they are white, they are
mhm,
European. They
mhm,
somehow
mhm,
seem
mhm,
to be overlooked, although there are millions of them. And what you see over
mhm,
there,
mhm,
it
mhm,
is exactly what I said: life, dynamic
mhm, mhm,
development,
mhm,
outlived modes, outlived belief systems, and outlived societal models are abandoned. New ones are adopted, and they are adopted in a very European form. Everybody will say,
mhm,
of
mhm,
course, that
mhm.
such a thing exists as a Euro Islam. Now, of course, your article talks about Eurabia. So that's quite a
Mm.
provocative article because Eurabia, of course, is something that has been despised by some of the great thinkers in the dissident right, like Guillaume Fay, who hated, of course,
Mm, mm, mm.
anything to do with Islam and anything to do with Arabia.
Yeah,
Do
yeah,
you
yeah,
think
yeah.
it essentially correct? Arabia
Mm.
or Euro-Islam? How do they relate to each other? What do you think?
I think they're one and the same. And what I mean by that is if we actually look at the very first usage of the term Europa, it's from about, I think, 500 or 600 BC. And it refers actually to a very, very small set of islands, or like a single island, right off the coast of Anatolia or Asia Minor back then, right? So when I use the term Eurabia, and I think in the essay, Eurabia Ascendant, Europe Reluctant, that's the first essay in the series. I'm going to write more by myself. But I also have like an entire tab in The Fall of the West, and the tab is Project Eurabia, right? So I've got my own essay, obviously. Then I've got essays that other Muslim thinkers and whatnot and scholars have written over the years. I kind of like do read aloud dictations of them. In terms of my concept, yeah, the demographic trends, the migration trends, there's other trends as well with regard to conversion and reversion numbers. So by the end of this century, even if you take the most modest trends, you're looking at a 25% Muslim population, right? So 25, 35%. So if you take the smaller number, 25%, what does that mean? It means out of the 600 million or so Europeans, there's going to be 150 million plus Muslims, right? Now, is that a majority? Obviously not. It's a very, very good size plurality. Europe is going to have lots of atheists as well. These are people who are more individualistic in the way they view the world. So, practically speaking, and in terms of like the pragmatics of day-to-day life, you're going to see European Islam rather really, whether it's the traditional communities that have been Muslim for a long time, the Albanians, whether it's the newer converts, the newer white converts in Germany, England, France, and so on and so forth, you're going to see this synthesis, but it's not going to be like a dominant synthesis. What I mean by that is the 25, 35%, whatever number we get to at the end of the century, it is going to forever change the way in which people live their lives, right? Uh, Obviously, some of them are going to be very obvious to figure out. You'll go to the grocery store and you're like, oh, there's a giant halal food section, right? Others are going to be a bit more like nuanced, right? So, for example, uh, animal rights, for example, with regard to, okay, certain things don't sell as much, or, I have Muslim neighbors now. What are they like? And then you'll see like charities with regard to the poor and the sick, the way in which zakat money is like utilized to help the needy and the poor and the sick and whatnot. And you'll see that all across European society. But that's kind of my vision of Eurabia. My vision of Eurabia is the mimetic Eurabia. It's not the Eurabia which is conquered via the sword, via, I don't know, the cannon or whatnot, because I don't think that is the approach. Also, I don't really see the need to do it. I don't think we are called, like, as Muslims, we are called to do certain things, right? Obviously, we have just war theory. Obviously, we have this notion of like, okay, fighting and striving, right, on the field of battle for the religion. But in terms of the modern contemporary European context, I don't think we need to do that. I think what's happening right now is there's a big vacuum, right? Obviously, I spoke about the inviting in the dissident right, but also there's this rapid decline in Christianity. There's this rapid increase in atheism. And people crave for meaning, purpose, and significance. I don't know if you've read the book, but like Michel Houellebecq, Submission, which is an excellent book. It's not Islamophobic, by the way. But like when you read the book, the real impression you get is Michel Houellebecq is less talking about Islam and Muslims, and he's more talking about the vapid, empty, and meaningless lives that even the intelligent Europeans live, right? I mean, the protagonist in the book is basically like he just spends his whole day, like, I don't know, buying up some hookers and doing all this other stuff, right? So, which we're not going to mention on this podcast, but, the dear listeners and readers want to read, they can read the book. But, his life is so just vapid and empty and meaningless. Towards the end of the book, Islam is really the only practical and pragmatic solution left for him, right? He looks at his life and he's like, well, what have I got to lose, right? I become Muslim. I get to have a better life. I get to have a better job. I get to be a polygamist. Maybe I get multiple wives. Maybe I live that life to its fullest meaning. Maybe I do all these other things. Maybe that's just better, right? Maybe let's turn the page, right? And I think that maybe that he had at the beginning, it kind of transformed from the maybe to the concrete. I think that's kind of the struggle that most Europeans are going through right now. You're correct, good sir. Eurabia is a scary thought. Everything new is scary at first, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I don't think it should be, right? I think Eurabia is a good thing in the grand scheme of things with regard to the current landscape we see and the current decline and fall and what comes after that, right? So something new is not necessarily a scary thing. Something new could be a very transformative and like a very, very positive thing as well.
Yes, in this regard, we should remind our audience that historically, the Middle East, large part of the Middle East and of North Africa, were Christian or Zoroastrian. So they had state religions, real state religions, to which almost the whole population adhered. There were also largely what we would call white people, Aryan people, Indo-European people, certainly for Iran and most of Asia Minor that applies, and also for parts of North Africa. These people very smoothly adopted a new religion. And they did so by their own wish, because they wanted to be rid of a repressive system that made their life empty, unrewarding, and that was exploitatively experienced by them. So it came as a liberation. And in this sense, I think it's very important to take away some of the great fears of Islam that are living among Europeans, especially. Now, two of them are, of course, their ethnic identity. This is a very important issue. So we have the white nationalists within the dissident right movement. These people, they believe that, let's say, their stock is threatened. And I do not think that is true. And you did some very relevant work on this point. You said ethnicity is a legitimate identity within Islam. Please, can you elaborate on
that? Yes. So there is a famous hadith, and the blessed Prophet ﷺ, he notes that a woman is to be married for four things, right? You've got beauty, you've got wealth, you've got lineage, and you've got piety. And, he emphasizes after that piety is the most important thing. But lineage actually is a big category under which race and ethnicity fall under, right? One of the things people have a misconception about Islam is that, if Eurabia becomes a reality, the white French or the white British or whatnot, we're going to become less and less. There's going to be all these like mixed marriages and it'll be gone and, things will fall apart. That's actually not the case, right? If you're Muslim, there's an expectation that if you're the father, for example, you actually have to evaluate the suitor that makes a, formal claim saying that I want to have your daughter in marriage, right? You can actually reject him by saying that, well, look, we want people of a certain lineage in our family. So, you're a nice guy, but, no thank you, right? You can actually do that, right? Now, obviously, there are polite ways of doing it and there's improper ways of doing it, but that's actually something you can do. So in a European Islam, in a Eurabian future, the white Muslims, right, whether it's in France, whether it's in England or whatnot, they can take that approach. They can take that approach of, okay, well, my daughter, I want her to marry someone who is from my particular lineage, with namely white French, and then he has these kind of views and whatnot. Really, the only requirement with regard to that particular story is Muslim women are expected to marry Muslim men, whereas Muslim men have the option of marrying also Christian women and Jewish women, right? So it's a bit more restricted for Muslim women on the one hand, but for Muslim men, it's a bit more expansive. But that's kind of like our way of looking at things. So ethnic, racial, and whatnot, these identities, they would be preserved, right? If there is sound application of the sacred law with regard to these matters.
Well, what you are saying is, of course, something that can be observed in the real world as being valid.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Because a
mm-hmm,
nation, I like to remind people, like Tajikistan, which is as Aryan and as Indo-European as it gets, where
mm-hmm,
people have been preserved in a very original state, but are completely Muslim. The whole nation is Muslim. But
mm-hmm,
they are living in
mm-hmm,
their homeland. They are
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
intermarrying for centuries already, and they have preserved
mm-hmm,
all their identity markers as before. So that's
mm-hmm,
a case in point, proving your thesis here. Now, of
mm-hmm,
course, another great fear of Europeans is the historical specter of, let's say, the Golden Horde, the outriders of it arriving and bringing doom and gloom to the West in a very violent way. This is, of course, something that the specter of the jihad, the violent
mm-hmm,
jihad.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
But I wonder, to what degree is that not a projection of the crusader mentality that has been fostered
mm-hmm,
ideologically here by the globalist empire, I would call? How do you see that?
mm-hmm,
I believe that whole Islamophobia is partially very artificial. It ties into people's fears, but it is,
mm-hmm,
let's say, ideologically fostered by the Western elite. And I think here we come to a point that is very important right now, because if there's any
mm-hmm,
point at which is crusader mentality is reliving itself, it's now.
mm-hmm.
It is something that
Yes,
is,
yes.
of course, focused in on the events in the Holy Land, I call it. So
Mm-hmm,
Palestine,
mm-hmm.
the Zionist entity there, and people are supposed to take sides, and they are taking sides. Now, this brings us in
Yes,
uh,
yes.
to geopolitical realm, your specialty, of course,
Mm-hmm,
very
mm-hmm,
important. And you, in this connection, in the connection of the confrontation between the globalist West, so the golden billion, as Putin calls it, and the rest,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
there is now a situation of struggle. Can you please explain that a little bit more clearly for our own?
Sure. With regard to what we are dealing with right now, once upon a time, if you were a European or North American, you could kind of have this abundance industrialism lifestyle. And what I mean by that is you have this cheap labor force, either your own labor force for a while after the post World War II environment, or cheap Chinese labor, cheap Vietnamese labor, whatnot. Then you'd have cheap energy from Russia and the Middle East, and then you would have cheap consumables, right? Initially, it was in the Western economies. Now it's primarily from China and the East, right? Now, when Emperor Vladimir, as I like to call him, or like President Vladimir Putin, when he says the golden billion, I think that's what he's referring to, namely this group of people from the Western world who have this idea that, well, look, we are simply entitled to this abundance industrialism lifestyle, right? And what myself and many other analysts say is, well, no, you're not, because this globalized economy, it doesn't come for free. It comes off of colonialism, imperialism, and all these other pursuits, right? Now, there's people out there who say, oh, haha, you guys are just like coping. This is just a skill issue. We conquered you, so all's fair in love and war. What I say to that is, look, human history is a very long thing, right? You can kind of treat people that way for a while, right? But later on in life, when you're in a rough spot and you need their help, if you talk like that, you're not going to get their help, right? So when people talk like this about, oh, we conquered you and, you need to give us your resources right now. I'm sorry, friends, but that's not what's going to happen, right? So with regard to the Middle East and what's happening right now, with regard to the apartheid settler colony, as I like to call it, doing their barbarous crimes, really what that is them realizing that it's not just a golden billion, it's not just American hegemony, but the whole house of cards is falling apart, right? I don't know if you noticed, good sir, but America right now, I think 35 point something trillion is the debt, but the more important number is actually, and you can check the US debt clock right now, it's like $872 billion and counting, right? And that's just the interest on the debt, right? Now, you'll meet people who say stuff like, "Oh, well, enough. The debt doesn't matter. It's just a random number, money printer go burr, nothing's going to happen." What I tell them is, mathematics is a cruel master, right? And the thing about money and money mechanics is that ultimately the money has to flow. It's like water, right? The water has to flow all over the place, whether it's in America or China and so on and so forth, right? Now, America's main creditors rather, America's main creditors are Japan number one and China number two, People's Republic of China. If you're paying $872 billion, right, of interest on the debt, and your revenues are like 4.6 trillion, and your expenses are like 6.5 or 7 trillion, my friend, you are on the verge of bankruptcy, right? Because that interest on the debt, eventually, right, it's going to get to well over a trillion, then 2 trillion. I mean, it's exponentially increasing as we speak, right? But the way things are going, and some people ran the numbers for me. These are like econometrics people, and they basically said that, yeah, the way things are going, within 20 years' time, there will be no money left whatsoever. The way at which the interest for the debt is going at. Now, you don't have to wait 20 years, right? It's like me telling you, and like, Malcolm Chayune, who we had on the podcast, he said this as well, which is like, if I told you that, oh, within 5 years, your entire body will be filled with cancer cells, okay, fair enough, but that's actually not going to happen because people die earlier than that. You don't need to get a 100% rate. You can get like a 10% or a 20% rate, right? So that's what the American economy is at right now. So to get back to the point, why is this important? The Israelis know this. The Israelis know this, and that's why they're doing their barbaric stuff in Palestine, in Lebanon, and so on and so forth. They know that now is the chance to finish the job, to get things done, because America is going to be bankrupt soon. It might take a few years, it might take a few months, several more months rather, but this is the last hurrah, right? And in terms of what's happening in Ukraine, I mean, Russia's basically about to win the war. I know that I've been saying this forever, dear listeners and readers, and you're like, enough. When are they going to win? Honest answer, I don't know, because I am not privy to Russian high command and what they know. But what I do know is the attritional war is extremely brutal. I think Simplicius and a few other Substack writers, they're saying that total casualties, so dead and wounded unsanitary, is well over 1.5 million Ukrainians. More than 7 million Ukrainians have left the country already. It's a brutal war. It's a brutal war. It's a human tragedy. But yeah, like the country is going to fall apart soon. The Chinese are basically doing drills. They're calling it a drill, but they're patrolling Taiwan. If they wanted to, like they can literally pick up the phone 1 hour from now and just tell the Americans, yeah, that drill that we were doing, actually, this is now a blockade. So you're not getting the semiconductors from Taiwan anymore, right? So that can happen as we finish up this podcast. A lot of other interesting things are happening. North Korea, for example, they've blown up the roads and the railway lines and whatnot, connecting them to South Korea. And they've put all of their artillery on full alert. So something could happen over there. Long story short, the big one, as people like to say, is about to break out. In many ways, we are actually in the prelude, or the latent phase, rather, of World War III. World War III has not gone active yet, right? It's kind of similar to how in 1931, when Japan invaded Manchuria, for that group of people, World War II, rather, began September 1931. Now, for Europeans, it began 1939, September, right? So, but I would say that we are well past the September 1931 point. We are at that point where we are far closer to the September 1939 moment than many of us would like to admit. But yeah, basically, this world war is going to be the one that really takes out the West, I feel, simply because, again, I've looked at America's military capabilities. I've looked at their table of equipment. There's no Army, Navy, or Air Force left to fight a war against multiple peer competitors. And by multiple, I mean Russia and China. With regard to people saying war with Iran, I don't know if they're going to go through with it, but if they do, that's going to be extremely brutal affair. If the Iranians shut down the Straits of Hormuz, which they're definitely going to do if America enters the war, that's 40% of the world oil supply. If you get $200 per barrel of oil, you're looking at $10, $20 gasoline. at which point logistics and all these other things, they fall apart. Uh, so industrial society as we know it is basically going to come to a screeching halt. And again, this is before we are even talking about nuclear weapons. We're not even talking about nuclear weapons right now, and the damage that would do to everything. Some people like to talk about the internet. Oh, what about the internet? My friend, the internet is a very fragile thing. I mean, we're having a very nice conversation right now over the internet, but there's a bunch of undersea cables that go through rather certain choke points all across the world. One of them actually goes through the Red Sea, where there's a de facto blockade by Yemen's Ansarallah. If they wanted to use a bunch of cheap submersible drones, which cost a few $100, they could actually take out the undersea cables there. So, the internet is not going to last. But this war that we are about to go fully kinetic into, I fully suspect that it's going to last for years and decades, right? We're not going to see a conclusion to it for a while, simply because the fighting potential, even though it's diminished for America, America is a country with access to the resources of an entire continent, right? And, Russia is the world's largest country, and China is basically the workshop of the world, right? So we're talking about three very formidable fighters and their respective alliance structures. So it's not going to be World War II. It's going to be much worse than that. I think I read a white paper back in the day, and I read several of them. But the estimate I got for overall casualties was 800 million dead and wounded on the lower end, and 2 billion dead and wounded on the higher end. So actually, contrary to popular belief, nuclear war is not the end of humanity. Nuclear war is basically like a knife wound to the kidney. It's very, very painful. It's very, very brutal, but humanity would still survive, right? And I think that's actually what's going to happen. I think we are going to enter World War III, but it's going to be a brutal affair, which many of us will survive. Many of us will die as well. But after that, yeah, the changes we're going to see, the geoeconomic changes, the geopolitical changes, and whatnot, they are going to be on the same effect, or maybe even higher than the changes we saw after 1492, when Christopher Columbus basically discovered America. But again, apologies for rambling, but that's kind of bird's eye view, big picture, 30,000 foot, what I'm seeing right now.
Well, of course, slowly wrapping up the podcast, I like to remind our audience that the dissident right, coming from European New Right, is in essence a liberation movement, a freedom movement. And from our perspective, Lenin's sayings are not entirely irrelevant. First, he said there are decades in which nothing happens, and then there are weeks in which decades happen. That is something that we are seeing in front of our eyes. And he said another thing: the worse it gets, the better it gets. Of course, we in the dissident right wouldn't mind seeing global Weimar printing itself out of existence, but also we wouldn't mind it being delivered decisive defeat by external enemies, so that we in the West can do some damage control and regain control of our own destiny. And in that regard, I'd like to ask your advice. If you look at the dissident right movement strategically, would you advise the dissident right as it stands now at this very particular moment in history?
Fair, fair. I would say that you guys don't have to be in love with the Muslims. You don't have to be in love with the Chinese. You don't have to be in love with the Russians. You can take a strictly business-like, pragmatic attitude. Again, you don't have to be our best friends. You don't have to be in love with us. Look at it from a strictly business point of view. Is it good for business for the world to blow itself up with nuclear weapons? No, it's not. Okay? That's the first thing. The second thing is, okay, now that we've acknowledged that, what can we do about it? I think this is a point in time where the peace movement is very, very crucial. Obviously, people have a lot of criticisms with regard to, oh, it's just people protesting and doing nothing. That's not entirely true. There are people, right? And I'm not encouraging this, by the way. I'm just making an observation. But there are people who've basically figured out that, okay, this is the weapons factory from which the shipments are going. And if we protest on this particular intersection, on this particular hour of this particular day, we can stop the weapons shipments from showing up to this part of the world and killing people, right? Now, again, you don't have to be in love with that part of the world. You don't have to love us. I'm saying that from a strictly strategic point of view, it is in your best interest to not have World War III go fully kinetic, right? The better outcome would be for the beast, or the great Satan, as I like to call it, to starve itself out. for the interest on the debt and all these other things and all these other contradictions and whatnot to finally catch up and make the Americans balkanize, right? So strategically, the best thing for you guys to do right now is to delay, 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 delay. I do not think it's a good idea to do like, some people like to say, oh, well, we're just going to seize power by force. I do not recommend that for obvious reasons. Because number one, we're on a podcast, and number two, uh, let's just say that it's an interesting proposal that's not going to get you the result that you think it is, right? So I would say delay, delay, delay. Uh, Industrial society in general is on its last legs, anyways. If the American empire, the global American empire, can be delayed sufficiently, the rest of the world has more than enough capability to do what needs to be done. I have no doubt whatsoever that the men of the Islamic resistance will triumph via their war of attrition, their guerrilla fighting and whatnot over the Zionist menace. I have no doubt that Russia will defeat the Azov Bandera people. I have no doubt that Taiwan, via a blockade, not an invasion, via a blockade, will be peacefully reunited. And I have no doubt that North Korea and South Korea, if America goes bust, will figure out a way to resolve their differences. But really, what I would recommend, I would recommend delay, 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 and figuring that out, right? Whether it's something active like the peace movement and protests and figuring out how to stop those weapons shipments, or it's something more passive with regard to writing articles, doing journalism, doing interviews, educating people and whatnot, or whether it's a combination of both, right? But that's kind of like my recommendations. Obviously, you don't have to listen to me. You could take the attitude that Ahnaf is the enemy or whatever you want to call me, but that's my honest assessment, basically.
Well, your advice, of course, ties into that of some other famous international spokespeople from outside the West, like Raif Marouf from Lebanon, and Professor Saeed Mohammed Morandi. He also has recommended similar things to Westerners. But finally, of course, you now give some tactical and strategic advice. There is also the larger picture. And of course, that is the final question. It is the eschatological question, because when we are talking about doom and gloom, doom is not just something that can be experienced on the personal level and that can inform our political worldview. It is also something that is contained in, let's say, the holy books of the great religions. Doom is present there. Judgment Day is present there.
Absolutely.
There are quite many people who perhaps would even welcome it, because, of course, God in His wrath has destroyed many evildoers, not only Sodom and Gomorrah, but many. In the Holy Quran and in the Bible, there are plenty of examples of this kind of let's say, divine interference in human affairs. We might be witnessing such a point, and the eschatological aspect of your writing is also it's quite subtle, but it's there. Finally, as a conclusion, can you say something about that, about the eschatological perspective on the present perspective on the present situation in the world?
Yeah, kullu nafsi za'iqatil maut. Every soul shall taste death, right? Death is normal. Again, for us Muslims, death is basically you going to the barzakh, the intermediary realm, and all souls are going to be resurrected, and eventually there's going to be a judgment of all souls. Individually, you are judged as individuals. You're not judged as collectives, right? That being said, other people can speak up for you or intercede on your behalf. But regard to death, that's the Islamic notion of death. That is our worldview. It's interesting you bring up death. I think actually, if we're going to be very, very meta about it, I think the way that Faustian man went astray was that when he looked at infinite linear expansion and all these other things, that was his way of kind of almost distracting himself from the notion of death, right? You see this a lot, especially with the transhumanist movement with regard to life elongation, or, oh, we're going to upload our mind to the, cloud consciousness thingamajigger, or we're going to do all this other stuff. We'll explore space and so on and so forth. And, the problem with all these things is that human beings, we are finite, we're limited. obviously the ruh, the soul, is boundless in the sense that it has this oath with God Almighty before time and space was created. It has this oath that it said, God Almighty asked all souls before they were created, before time and space existed, rather, am I not your Lord? And they all said, yay, right? So in that sense, there is an infinitude, right? But in terms of like the body and these other things, we are finite, right? We're not going to be doing a lot of these things. Uh, a lot of the aspects of the modern world today is basically a runaway uh, problem slash predicament of like pursuing these things, namely the infinitude of like, okay, well, I'm going to live forever. I'll do all this stuff and yada, yada, yada. Right. So I think death is something which Westerners, there's Christians who understand what I'm talking about, but there's a lot of Westerners who don't. Right. And I think like rediscovering that death is not the end, death is actually something to look forward to when you've lived a virtuous life, when you've lived a life of meaning, significance, and purpose, when you've done good deeds, when you've done all this stuff. I think once that is rediscovered at large, that is going to give sakina or tranquility to Westerners. And I think, yeah, a lot of them will become Muslim, right? Now, obviously, not all of them will, right? But it's one of those things where I think the content life, the life of tranquility, the life of moderation and temperance and all these other things, that's just a better life. The life of like, oh, I have to constantly doubt things. I have to constantly run after things. I have to constantly figure out how to do this project or that project. That's not the human life. That is the life of basically the transhuman, the post-human, and it's not a life worth living, right? And so a life worth living is the life that prepares you for death, right? So that's kind of like my, I don't want to get too theological because, I'm a student, I'm no master, I'm not a teacher, whatnot, but that's kind of like my 2 cents on the matter.
Well, on that very inspiring note, I think we can end this podcast, reminding our audience of the fact that heroism and the heroic death is not something entirely alien to the European tradition either.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And that
absolutely.
If people want to see a modern version of the heroic death and the tranquility in death and in life, they can just look at the examples of the great martyrs of the last weeks, Yahya Sinwar,
Absolutely.
Sheikh Nasrallah. They are inspiring on a level that actually goes above any kind of religion and any kind of political preference. They just show manhood, humanhood, and honor and dignity in the face of life and its challenges. So having said all that,
yeah, subhanallah, that's amazing. Yeah.
Thank you very much for being with us, Ahnaf. We will be happy to receive you on another podcast, but this is it for today. And thanks to the audience for attending and listening to our broadcast. Thank you.